The sun had barely risen that chilly morning when Mia's mother, Linda, snapped at her from the kitchen. "Mia, you're late again. Get a move on." Linda's strictness was a constant fixture in their household. Her overbearing discipline came from years of being a single mother, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. It was her way of ensuring Mia, their only child, wouldn't fall behind in life. Mia, a 20-year-old college student, was used to the routine by now, being rushed out the door by her mother every morning, always reminded of her responsibilities, but never truly understood. Linda's demands were heavy, but Mia didn't complain. She knew her mother worked hard for everything they had, even though Mia's heart often longed for more warmth in their relationship. They had never really been close. Linda's tough love approach left no room for affection, and Mia's quiet rebellion was her only way of coping. Mia grabbed her backpack, kissed her mother on the cheek, and hurried out the door, the cold air biting at her skin. The bus stop was only a few blocks away, so she didn't mind walking. Her thoughts often wandered during these early morning walks, thoughts of the day ahead, the daunting assignments she had, and the hope that one day, things between her and Linda would improve. But on this particular day, something felt different. As she passed the familiar street corner, she noticed a white van idling at the curb. It wasn't anything unusual at first, just another vehicle. But the moment she glanced over, she froze. The driver was staring at her through the rearview mirror. His face was grim, expressionless. Then, he smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold and unsettling. Mia hesitated, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She had heard stories, horror stories from the news about abductions, even though they were rare. Still, she didn't feel safe. She quickened her pace, pretending not to notice him, but the van began to follow her. Panic set in. She glanced over her shoulder again, and now, the van was pulling closer. Her heart raced as her breath grew shallow. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. The van was after her. Mia's instincts kicked in, and she turned into a side street, hoping to lose him in the winding residential roads. But as she rounded the corner, she found herself face to face with the van, parked right in front of her. The door swung open. Before she could react, a man leapt out and grabbed her by the arm, yanking her into the vehicle. A scream caught in her throat, but it was muffled by a rough hand pressed against her mouth. Her vision blurred as panic consumed her. She tried to push away, kicking and thrashing, but the grip on her was too strong. "Be quiet, girl," the man growled. "You'll make this harder on yourself." Mia's mind raced. She fought with everything she had, trying to claw her way out of his grip, but the van door slammed shut. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the vehicle sped off, and she was helpless, trapped. Her thoughts scrambled. Why had this happened to her? She had just been on her way to class, to a normal day. But now, everything was shifting. The world around her no longer felt real. The van swerved violently as it took a sharp turn, heading away from the city streets. Mia couldn't get a good look at the man's face as he sat across from her, his cold eyes piercing through her. His silence was unnerving. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. But he didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a thick piece of duct tape from his pocket and slapped it over her mouth, silencing her protests. The journey seemed endless. Hours passed, and Mia was helpless to stop it. The van took her deeper into the woods, and soon, the city lights disappeared completely. Mia's fear intensified. What was happening? Where was he taking her? She was just a college student trying to make it through life. Why her? Eventually, the van came to a stop. The man's grip remained firm on her arm as he pulled her out of the van, dragging her toward a large, decrepit house. It stood isolated, surrounded by trees, as if forgotten by time itself. The house looked abandoned, its windows dark, and its walls covered in vines. The air was thick with tension. He forced her inside, shoving the door open with one swift motion. The smell of mildew and decay filled Mia's nostrils, making her stomach churn. She could hardly breathe, her mind still spinning in disbelief. "This is where you'll stay now," the man said flatly, locking the door behind them. His voice sent chills down her spine. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but there was nothing. No one. She was completely alone. The man led her down into the basement. The stone walls were damp, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and dirt. As he forced her into a dark corner of the room, Mia felt her heart sink. She was trapped in a nightmare. Tears began to well in her eyes as the reality of the situation set in. She was a prisoner. The door slammed shut, and she heard the sound of heavy chains rattling. Her heart pounded against her chest. What was going to happen to her now? The man returned, his expression colder than ever. He stood over her and said one chilling sentence, "You're mine now." Mia had no idea what that meant. The world as she knew it had disappeared, and in its place, there was only terror. The days blurred together as Mia sat in that cold, damp basement. The chains around her ankles were the only things that anchored her to the reality of her situation. Every time she tried to move, the cold metal would scrape against the concrete floor, a constant reminder that she was a prisoner. She could feel the bruises forming on her wrists from the tight grip the man had held on her when he brought her in. She hadn't seen him much since that first night, and that alone terrified her. His absence felt more sinister than his presence. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of floorboards from upstairs. Mia was left alone in the dark for hours, sometimes days. She had no way of telling time, no windows to gauge the passing of the hours. The only thing that marked the change of day was when the man would bring her food, dry bread and water. If she was lucky, there might be a bit of soup, but that was rare. The food was barely enough to sustain her, but it wasn't the hunger that consumed her. It was the gnawing fear, the uncertainty of her future. The first few days, she tried to escape. When the man would leave to do something upstairs, she would pull against the chains, trying to break free. Her body was sore from the constant strain, but she refused to give up. She kicked the walls, screamed into the darkness, hoping someone would hear. But no one came. Her efforts were futile. One night, the man returned, his footsteps echoing through the house. The sound of the heavy door opening brought a wave of dread over Mia. He didn't speak to her at first, just stared at her with those cold eyes. Mia could barely make out his features in the dim light of the basement. His face was pale, and his hair was unkempt, like he hadn't bothered to care about his appearance for days. His presence made the air feel heavier, thicker, as though every breath she took was filled with fear. "Did you really think you could get away?" he asked, his voice almost taunting. Mia said nothing. There was no use in answering him anymore. He didn't care, and the truth was, she didn't care either. All that mattered now was surviving. The man continued his cruel games, some days bringing a camera and forcing her to pose in ways that made her skin crawl. Other times, he would bring a knife, threatening to cut her if she didn't do what he wanted. He'd smile when she trembled, his twisted sense of power feeding off her fear. One day, he tried something different. When he opened the basement door, his eyes lingered on her with a sinister intensity. "I think it's time you learn your place," he said, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her to her feet. Mia's mind raced. She knew he was becoming increasingly unstable. His behavior had grown more unpredictable, more dangerous. But something inside her clicked. The fear that once paralyzed her began to turn into something else, something sharper. She wasn't sure what she would do yet, but she knew she had to find a way out. For the next few days, she observed him, carefully studying his habits. She noted the hours when he would go upstairs, how he always left the door to the basement unlocked when he left. Every minute, every second, became a new opportunity for her. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't wait for a miracle. Her survival depended on her ability to outsmart him. Her first real attempt at escape came the following week. The man had grown complacent. He had stopped checking on her so frequently, perhaps because he thought she was too weak to fight back. One night, when he went upstairs to sleep, Mia saw her chance. She yanked on the chains, forcing them to rattle loudly. At first, she thought the noise would alert him, but then, as if by luck, she heard nothing. No footsteps. No door opening. With shaking hands, she fumbled for the lock on the chains. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she focused, every motion deliberate, precise. The lock finally gave way, and her ankles were free. Mia crept towards the basement door, her breath barely audible as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, but no one was there. She had done it. She had escaped. The upstairs was quiet. She moved cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible. There were no sounds of the man stirring. The house was eerily silent, and Mia's footsteps were the only sound that filled the air. She passed through the darkened hallway, trying to recall the layout of the house. Her eyes finally landed on the front door. The key. She needed the key. But where was it? Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it might be in the man's pocket. There was no time to waste. The door was her only hope. She glanced around, searching for anything that might help her. And then, she saw it, a set of keys on a table near the door. With trembling hands, Mia grabbed them, praying they would open the door. She rushed to the door, inserting the key into the lock. She turned it slowly, feeling the tension rise in her chest. Then, with a click, the door opened. Fresh air rushed into the house as Mia stepped outside, her feet hitting the cold grass. For the first time in days, she could breathe. She could move. But she wasn't free yet. Mia ran. Her legs burned, and her lungs ached, but she pushed through the pain. The woods were dense, and she knew they would be her only chance to escape. She had to keep moving, to survive. The trees provided some cover, but she knew he would be after her soon. She didn't look back. Mia's breath was ragged as she ran through the dense forest, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, her body aching with every step. The cold night air whipped past her face, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and eerie in the dim light. Her mind raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins. There was no turning back now. The man was out there, somewhere, and if he caught her, she knew he wouldn't stop until he had her back in his grip. Her legs burned from the effort, but she couldn't afford to slow down. The further she got from the house, the safer she would be. She kept pushing herself, the rustling of the leaves beneath her feet the only sound, until she found a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. It was a small break, something that could offer her some hope. She paused for a moment, crouching behind a thick tree trunk to catch her breath. Sweat soaked her clothes, and she could feel the exhaustion settling in, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to keep her wits about her. She couldn't let fear overwhelm her now. Her survival depended on it. Suddenly, a distant sound reached her ears, a snap of twigs, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Her heart skipped a beat. He was following her. The man's footsteps were slow at first, deliberate, as if savoring the chase. Mia's pulse quickened. She couldn't afford to be caught. She stood up, her legs trembling, and began to run again, faster this time, weaving between the trees as she tried to gain distance. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the man's footsteps echoing through the woods. She pushed forward, ignoring the sting in her side. She wasn't just running from him anymore, she was running for her life. But as she rounded a bend in the path, her foot caught on a root hidden in the underbrush. She fell to the ground, a harsh impact sending a shockwave of pain through her body. She cried out, her palms scraping against the rough earth. She scrambled to get up, but before she could rise, she heard him, his voice, low and mocking, just behind her. You can't hide from me forever. Her blood ran cold. She had to keep moving. There was no time to lose. Panic surged within her, pushing her to her feet. She ran blindly, her feet slipping in the dirt, branches whipping her face. But she didn't care. She had to escape. The man's voice echoed in the distance, growing louder as he gained on her. Suddenly, she spotted a small creek ahead, the sound of rushing water growing stronger with each step. It was her chance. She could lose him if she crossed the creek. The water would mask her scent, and he wouldn't be able to track her. Without hesitation, Mia dove into the creek, the icy water slapping against her skin as she stumbled through the shallow stream. Her teeth chattered from the cold, but she didn't stop. She waded through the water, slipping on the slippery rocks beneath her feet, but she pushed forward. The water was her lifeline now. She heard the man's footsteps falter behind her, then a curse under his breath. He had lost her trail. Mia didn't look back. She kept moving, knowing that every second counted. The creek led to a thick thicket, and Mia followed the path as it curved around, deeper into the forest. The foliage became more dense, the trees closing in around her as she ventured further away from the man. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time felt like it had stopped entirely. Mia had no idea where she was or how far she'd gone, but she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't rest, not yet. The darkness of the night had fully settled in, and the forest seemed alive with strange sounds. Suddenly, she heard something else, a rustling in the bushes ahead. Her heart stopped, and for a split second, she thought it was him. But as the noise grew louder, she realized it was not his footsteps. It was something different. Someone else was out there. Mia froze, listening carefully. She could hear the sound of voices, muffled and distant. Hope surged through her chest. She wasn't alone. She pushed forward again, moving slowly this time, her senses alert for any sign of danger. She reached the edge of a small clearing, where she saw them, figures huddled around a fire. They were two men, dressed in heavy jackets, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. They didn't seem to notice her at first. Mia stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. She needed help. She didn't know if they would trust her, but it was her only chance. Please, she whispered, barely audible, but one of the men turned at the sound of her voice. Hey, are you all right? One of the men called out, his voice rough but kind. He stood up, walking toward her. You look like you've been running for your life. I have, Mia said, her voice shaky. She felt a rush of relief, but she didn't let her guard down just yet. Please, I need help. I'm being chased. The man looked at his companion, who stood still, eyeing Mia warily, before he nodded. Come with us, the man said, leading her toward the fire. You're safe now. Mia collapsed beside the fire, exhaustion finally taking over her body. The warmth of the flames was a welcome relief against the chill of the night. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep running, she murmured, her hands trembling as she reached for the warmth of the fire. He won't stop until he finds me. We'll keep you safe, the man assured her. Don't worry. We've got your back. But as Mia sat there, the flickering light casting shadows over her face, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man, her captor, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the night dragged on, Mia stayed with the men, her body sore and weary, but her mind was still sharp. She knew the man would come for her. He would never stop. And she couldn't let her guard down now, not when she was so close to freedom. The men gave her food and water, but their presence didn't ease her anxiety. The fire burned low, casting long shadows around them as the hours passed. Mia's heart thudded in her chest as she listened to every crack of the woods, every rustle in the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It wasn't until the sound of footsteps broke the silence that Mia's blood ran cold. There he was. Her captor stood in the shadows, his figure barely visible in the darkness, watching them. His eyes were wide with rage, and his mouth curled into a twisted grin. "You thought you could get away from me," he spat, stepping forward into the clearing. "I'll make sure you never escape again." Before Mia could react, the man lunged at her, but the two men who had been helping her sprang into action. They tackled him to the ground, pinning him down with surprising strength. "Get away from her," one of the men shouted, holding the captor down. "You're not taking her back." The fight that followed was chaotic. Mia watched as the men fought to subdue her captor, each moment feeling like it would be her last. The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath them trembling as the men struggled to gain control. In the end, the captor was overpowered. He was pinned to the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back, and the two men stood over him, breathing heavily from the effort. Mia felt a rush of emotion flood through her. She was free. She was safe. The fire crackled softly as the early morning light began to filter through the trees. The night's chaos had ended, and now all that remained was the tense silence that followed the confrontation. Mia sat a few feet away, her legs pulled to her chest, her eyes still wide with